Case 1. Sabrina A. Sawicki, April 24, 2017, Laramie County, Wyoming. Cheyenne, Wyoming is a city that prides itself on community. A place where families build their lives across generations, where neighbors still check on one another, and where the protection of children sits at the very heart of what it means to belong to this corner of the American West. But even in Cheyenne, even in the kind of neighborhood where front porches see the same faces year after year, doors close. And behind closed doors, things can happen that shatter the quiet entirely. On April 24, 2017, emergency services in Laramie County received a call that would set in motion one of the most talked about cases in Cheyenne's recent history. A 16-month-old boy, a toddler barely past the age of his first birthday, was in a state of medical crisis. First responders arrived at the home and found a child whose condition alarmed every professional on the scene. He was rushed to the hospital immediately. The medical team that received him worked quickly and with urgency. What they documented as they evaluated this child were injuries to his brain, severe, irreversible neurological harm that no accident of ordinary household life could adequately explain. The physicians who examined him understood what they were seeing. Investigators were contacted. The process of determining what had happened to this 16-month-old boy inside his own home began. His mother was Sabrina A. Sawicki. She was the adult responsible for his care on that April day. As investigators from the Cheyenne Police Department began building their case, and as the medical team continued working to stabilize the child, the picture that emerged from the evidence pointed in a single, deeply troubling direction. For 3 days, that little boy held on. He was 16 months old enough to recognize the people around him, old enough to have developed the particular personality and presence that every toddler carries like a fingerprint, old enough to matter to everyone who knew him in a way that made the vigil around his hospital bed one of the most painful things his family had ever endured. On April 27, 2017, he did not survive. The death of this child triggered the full weight of the Laramie County investigative and prosecutorial apparatus. The injuries documented by the medical examiner were described by prosecutors as consistent with abusive head trauma, a pattern of neurological harm associated with the violent shaking of a very young child. This is not a pattern of injury that results from a fall from a couch or a stumble on a carpet. These are injuries that speak to force, to deliberation, to something done to a child who had no ability to resist or to call for help. Sabrina A. Sawicki was arrested. She was charged with first-degree murder and aggravated child abuse in Laramie County, Wyoming, two of the most serious charges that the Wyoming criminal justice system can bring against any person. The charges reflected the prosecution's position that what had happened to this 16-month-old boy was not an accident. It was not a tragic coincidence. It was harm inflicted by the person entrusted with his safety. The case moved through the Laramie County court system over the following months, with significant public and media attention. Wyoming is not a large state, and Cheyenne is not a city so large that a case like this one can remain anonymous. The community watched. Parents with young children of their own followed the proceedings with the particular anguish of those who understand viscerally what it means for a toddler to be vulnerable and dependent and unable to speak for himself. The trial proceeded. The prosecution presented its medical evidence, the documentation of the neurological harm, the expert testimony connecting those injuries to abusive head trauma, the investigative timeline placing Sawicki as the responsible caregiver during the period in which the injuries occurred. The prosecution's case rested on the argument that the evidence, taken in its totality, pointed unmistakably to deliberate harm. The defense took a different position. In courtrooms across the country in recent years, the medical and legal communities have engaged in an increasingly prominent debate about the diagnostic framework historically associated with abusive head trauma in infants and toddlers. Defense attorneys in cases involving this type of injury have increasingly called upon medical experts who argue that the pattern of symptoms traditionally associated with this diagnosis can, in some circumstances, result from causes other than deliberate harm. It is a genuine scientific debate, one that has affected the outcomes of cases in multiple jurisdictions and that reflects the difficulty of establishing, beyond a reasonable doubt, the cause of internal injuries in a very young child. The Laramie County jury heard all of it. They heard the prosecution's witnesses. They heard the defense's witnesses. They deliberated with the full weight of the evidence before them and the full weight of the legal standard they were required to apply. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt. In April of 2018, 1 year after the day the 16-month-old boy was hospitalized, the jury returned its verdict. Not guilty. On all charges. First-degree murder, not guilty. Aggravated child abuse, not guilty. Sabrina A. Sawicki walked out of the Laramie County Courthouse a free woman under the law. The American legal system is built on the principle that the burden of proof rests with the prosecution. It is built on the understanding that it is better for the system to fail to convict than to convict someone who has not been proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. A not guilty verdict is not a declaration that a crime did not occur. It is a declaration that the prosecution did not meet the legal threshold required to establish guilt in the eyes of 12 people who heard all of the evidence. That is what the system produced in the case of Sabrina A. Sawicki. And yet the facts that sit outside the verdict's reach remain. A 16-month-old boy was hospitalized on April 24, 2017, with injuries that his medical team described as severe and irreversible. He did not survive. He was 16 months old. He had been in the care of one adult on the day those injuries occurred. The medical examiner documented what was found. The jury heard it all and concluded that the prosecution had not proven its case. The community of Cheyenne was left, as communities often are after high-profile acquittals in cases involving harm to children, with a complex and uncomfortable space between what the law determined and what many people believed. That space does not resolve easily. It does not resolve at all for many who followed this case closely. It becomes part of the community's memory, a reference point in ongoing conversations about how the legal system handles cases where the only witness is too young to speak and the evidence is interpreted differently by different experts. What remains undisputed, what no verdict can touch, is the memory of a 16-month-old boy in Cheyenne, Wyoming, who did not survive April of 2017. He deserved to grow up in this city. He deserved the years and the ordinary accumulation of experiences that make a life. He deserved to be safe in the place where he slept. The legal record of Laramie County reflects what the court system produced. The community's memory reflects something that courtrooms cannot fully contain. For anyone watching this who works with young children, as a teacher, a childcare provider, a pediatric medical professional, or in any capacity that gives you regular contact with toddlers and infants, please trust your instincts when something seems wrong. The Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline is available 24 hours a day at 1-800-422-4453. A phone call costs nothing. A child's life is everything. The Laramie County court system processed this case to its legal conclusion. The verdict stands. And his 16-month-old boy's story is part of Cheyenne's history, told here so that he is not forgotten, and so that the community's commitment to its youngest and most vulnerable members is renewed with every story that is honestly told. If this case moved you, if it reminded you of why these stories matter, please take a moment right now to like this video, drop a comment below, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Your support means everything, and it keeps these important stories reaching the people who need to hear them. Case 2, Tranyelle Harshman, February 10, 2025, Bighorn County, Wyoming. There are tragedies that arrive with a slow build, warning signs, escalating circumstances, moments that in retrospect form a trail of evidence pointing toward what was coming. And then there are tragedies that arrive like a rupture in the earth beneath a community's feet, sudden, total, leaving nothing recognizable in their wake. What happened in Byron, Wyoming in the early hours of February 10, 2025, belongs to the second kind. And it left a wound in Bighorn County that the passage of time has only begun to address. Byron is a small, rural community in the northwestern corner of Wyoming. It is the kind of place where people know their neighbors across distances measured in acres rather than feet, where the quiet of a winter morning can be absolute, and where the arrival of emergency vehicles on a residential road draws immediate and anxious attention from everyone within sight or sound of them. It is not a place where the unthinkable is supposed to happen. On the morning of February 10, 2025, it happened anyway. Emergency dispatchers in Bighorn County received a call. The caller was a woman named Tranyelle Harshman. She was calling from her own home. She was calling to report that shots had been fired, inside the house where she lived with her children. She was calling, in other words, to report what she herself had just done. Bighorn County deputies responded with the urgency that any report of gunfire in a residential location demands. What they found when they arrived at that home is the kind of scene that law enforcement professionals carry with them for the rest of their careers, that settles into the memory not as a professional experience, but as something more permanent and more personal than that. Inside the home, Tranyelle Harshman's 4 daughters had been shot. 3 of them, 2 little girls who were each 2 years old and a 9-year-old, had not survived. They were found at the scene. A 7-year-old girl was alive, critically injured, clinging to life with the tenacity that children sometimes display in ways that humble every adult around them, but alive. Tranyelle Harshman had turned the firearm on herself following the shootings. She was transported for emergency medical treatment, but the injuries she had sustained were beyond what medical intervention could address. She did not survive. She passed away the following day, February 11, 2025. The 7-year-old survivor was transported by emergency air medical services to a hospital in Salt Lake City, Utah. She was the last remaining member of what had been, just hours before, a household of 5. She was 7 years old, critically injured, and fighting for her life in a hospital hundreds of miles from the only home she had ever known, surrounded by medical professionals she had never met, in a city far from the Wyoming landscape that had been the backdrop of every day of her short life. For several days, she fought. The medical team in Salt Lake City worked. And there was hope, the kind of desperate, fragile hope that people hold on to in the face of terrible odds, because the alternative is to stop hoping, and that is something the human heart resists with everything it has. The hope did not hold. Days after the shooting, the 7-year-old girl also passed away at the hospital in Salt Lake City. All 4 daughters were gone. The entirety of this family's next generation, 2-year-olds, a 7-year-old, a 9-year-old, had been taken within days of one another in the aftermath of a single February morning. The investigation that Bighorn County law enforcement undertook in the wake of these events was tasked with a particular kind of challenge. Because Tranyelle Harshman did not survive, there would be no trial. There would be no courtroom in which evidence would be presented, no defense to be offered, no jury to deliberate, no verdict to be read. The legal architecture of accountability, the machinery that the justice system deploys when a living defendant must answer for their conduct, had no living defendant to process. What investigators were left with was documentation. The work of understanding, as fully and as accurately as possible, what had led to that February morning. The reconstruction of a family's circumstances, of whatever pressures and crises and internal and external forces had converged in Tranyelle Harshman's life in the period leading up to February 10th. This is the work that law enforcement does not for the purposes of prosecution, but for the purposes of understanding, because understanding is the only tool communities have for prevention. Cases in which a parent takes the lives of their children and then takes their own are among the most studied and least understood events in the landscape of family tragedy. Researchers who examine these cases have identified patterns: the presence of severe depression, the experience of perceived hopelessness or entrapment, distorted thinking in which a parent comes to believe, however catastrophically wrongly, that their children cannot survive without them or would be better served by not surviving at all. None of these patterns constitute explanation in any satisfying sense. There is no framework adequate to the reality of 4 children who did not come home from that February morning. The 2-year-old girls had barely begun. They were at the age of discovery, of language expanding daily, of the world revealing itself in ways that are entirely new and entirely wondrous. The 9-year-old was at an age of growing independence, of school friendships and developing interests, and the particular confidence that comes from moving through the world with 9 years of experience behind you. The 7-year-old fought for days with a strength that spoke to everything she still wanted to do, everything she still wanted to be. None of them chose what happened to them on February 10th, 2025. None of them had any voice in it, any power over it, any way to protect themselves from it. They were children in the care of an adult, dependent in the way that children are always dependent, completely and without reservation, and with the particular trust that children extend to the people who are supposed to be their protection in the world. Bighorn County and the broader Wyoming community responded to this tragedy with the communal grief that descends on a small state when something this devastating occurs. Resources were made available. Community members gathered in the ways that communities do when the loss is too large for any individual to carry alone. Words were attempted and found insufficient, as words always are in the face of something this complete. The resources that exist to support families in crisis exist precisely because moments of crisis can build toward catastrophe when they go unaddressed. If you or someone you know is experiencing a mental health emergency, please reach out immediately to the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline by calling or texting 988. If you are concerned about the safety of children in a household you know, the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline at 1-800-422-4453 is available around the clock. The call that reaches a family in crisis before a tragedy occurs is the most important call anyone can make. For daughters, a February morning in Byron, Wyoming. A wound in Bighorn County that the community will carry for a very long time. Their names belong to Wyoming's history, not as a cautionary statistic, but as 4 individual human beings, brief, irreplaceable, and mourned by everyone who has since learned what happened on that morning. The awareness of what occurred, the honest and unflinching telling of this story, is the least that can be offered to them now. Please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. These stories are told so that the people at their center are never reduced to a headline and never forgotten entirely. Thank you for watching. Case 3. Eva Martinez, February 28, 1988, Laramie County, Wyoming. Some cases are solved within hours. The evidence is immediate, the suspect is identifiable, and the machinery of justice begins turning before the week is out. These are the cases that make the daily news and then recede from public memory as the news cycle moves on. And then there are the cases that do not resolve. The cases that sit in file drawers through one decade, and then another, and then another. The cases where a victim has no name, where no one comes forward, where the technology needed to find the answer does not yet exist. The cases that investigators keep alive not because the system demands it, but because something in the human conscience refuses to accept that an unresolved death can simply be shelved and forgotten. The case of baby John Doe, whose body was discovered on February 28, 1988, near the intersection of Happy Jack Road and McKinney Drive on the outskirts of Cheyenne, Wyoming, is one of those cases. It endured for 38 years. And in June of 2026, it finally moved toward resolution. On that February morning in 1988, someone walking near the edge of Cheyenne's familiar landscape made a discovery that would open one of Laramie County's longest-running investigations. A newborn baby boy had been left there, unclothed, exposed to the cold of a Wyoming winter. Without a name, without a record, without any of the documentation that marks a child's arrival in the world as an event that has been acknowledged and welcomed, law enforcement responded. A medical examiner was called. An autopsy was performed with the thoroughness that any suspicious death demands, and particularly a death involving a newborn child whose very existence had been concealed from the world. The autopsy established a fact that transformed this case permanently. The baby had been born alive. He had drawn breath in this world. He had existed, however briefly, as a living human being, and then he had been left in the cold near Happy Jack Road, where no one who loved him would find him, because there was no one who loved him in the position to search. He was given a name, Baby John Doe, the placeholder name that law enforcement assigns to unidentified victims because even those who cannot be named deserve to be recorded, to be counted, to be held in the investigative record as individuals whose lives mattered and whose deaths require accountability. He was given a proper burial by the Cheyenne community, and his case was opened as a homicide investigation. 1988 was not a year rich in forensic tools. DNA analysis existed in the most rudimentary early forms, barely deployed in criminal investigations, nowhere near the sophistication that would eventually transform cold case work across the country. Forensic genetic genealogy, the methodology that would ultimately crack this case, did not exist in any usable form. The investigators who opened Baby John Doe's file in February of 1988 worked with what was available to them. Physical evidence from the scene, a canvas of the surrounding area, Attempts to identify through medical and community records any woman in the Cheyenne region who had recently given birth without any corresponding documentation of a living child. It was difficult work, and it did not produce an answer. The weeks passed. The months passed. The file remained open because that is what investigators do with homicide cases. They keep them open because every victim is owed the pursuit of accountability regardless of how long that pursuit takes. The years accumulated. 1990, 1995, 2000, 2005. Through 2 full decades of changes in law enforcement technology, in forensic science, in the culture and practice of cold case investigation, baby John Doe's file endured. The child who had been found near Happy Jack Road remained nameless in the official record, and the person responsible for leaving him there remained unidentified. What changed the equation was science. Forensic genetic genealogy is a methodology that has reshaped the landscape of cold case investigation in the United States over the past decade. It works by taking DNA evidence collected from a crime scene or a victim, evidence that may have been collected years or even decades earlier, and running it against publicly available genealogy databases populated by the DNA profiles of people who have submitted their genetic information in the pursuit of ancestry research or family connection. When a match is identified, investigators can begin the painstaking process of building a family tree, identifying relatives of the unknown individual, and tracing those family connections through records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, census data, public records of every kind, until the field of possible candidates narrows to a single identifiable person. It is meticulous work. It requires specialized analysts, legal authorization, and a willingness to follow threads of evidence through layers of family history that may span generations. It cannot be rushed. But when it works in a way that no other forensic tool quite replicates. It reaches back across time and connects a name to evidence that has been waiting, preserved in a laboratory, for the science to be ready. In 2026, that science was ready for baby John Doe. The DNA evidence collected from the scene near Happy Jack Road in February of 1988 had been preserved through the intervening 38 years with the care that law enforcement devotes to the evidence of serious unsolved cases. That evidence was submitted for forensic genetic genealogy analysis. The analysts began their work. The family trees were constructed. The records were traced. The candidates were narrowed. And the evidence led to Eva Martinez. In June of 2026, 38 years and several months after a newborn boy was found near a road on the outskirts of Cheyenne, Laramie County authorities arrested Eva Martinez on charges of first-degree murder in the death of baby John Doe. The DNA evidence, developed through the forensic genetic genealogy process, linked her to the child found near Happy Jack Road in the winter of 1988. At the time of her arrest, Eva Martinez was decades removed from the woman she had been in 1988. 38 years is a long time. It encompasses careers, relationships, addresses, identities built and rebuilt over the long passage of time that makes up an adult life. Whatever the circumstances had been in February of 1988, whatever crisis, whatever fear, whatever desperation had existed in the life of the young woman who made the choices that ended in that child being left near Happy Jack Road, those circumstances had long since been buried under the accumulated years of an ordinary existence. But the evidence had been preserved, and the science had advanced. And the investigators who had kept baby John Doe's file alive through the long decades of waiting had made sure that when the technology was ready, the case was ready to meet it. Wyoming, along with every other state in the nation, has a safe haven law. Under Wyoming's Safe Haven Act, a parent in crisis can surrender a newborn child at any hospital, fire station, or law enforcement agency, anonymously, without providing identification and without facing prosecution. The child's life is preserved. The parent receives help rather than handcuffs. The tragedy that unfolded near Happy Jack Road in February of 1988 did not have to unfold. There were options. There was a path that did not end with a newborn boy left alone in a Wyoming winter. Baby John Doe deserved to know that path existed. He deserved to be brought to safety, to be placed in the care of people who would give him a name, a home, and the years of ordinary human experience that constitute a life. He received none of those things. He received a cold morning near a road and 38 years of anonymity in a case file. Until June of 2026. The legal proceedings against Eva Martinez were ongoing as of the time this documentary was prepared. She is presumed innocent under the law until and unless a court determines otherwise through the full process of trial and verdict. The legal process will run its course in Laramie County. But baby John Doe is no longer entirely nameless in the investigative record. After 38 years, the DNA evidence preserved from that February morning has produced a name, a suspect, a charge, a case moving toward legal resolution in the courts of Laramie County. For every investigator who refused to close that file, for every scientist who advanced the technology that made this identification possible, and for the child who was found without a name near Happy Jack Road in the winter of 1988, this is what accountability looks like when it finally arrives, delayed by decades, but arriving nonetheless. If you know someone facing an unplanned pregnancy in crisis, please help connect them with Wyoming's Safe Haven resources or with the National Safe Haven Alliance at 1-800-786-SAFE. A child's life can be preserved without anyone having to face the kind of desperate, isolated decision-making that the evidence in this case suggests took place near Happy Jack Road in February of 1988. Baby John Doe's story is part of Cheyenne's history. 38 years is a long time to wait for justice to begin its work. We tell his story so that he is not forgotten, and so that the community's commitment to pursuing accountability for its most vulnerable members, however long that pursuit takes, is understood and honored. If this story moved you, please like this video, leave a comment below, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. 38 years. One name. One case that refused to be forgotten. Case 4, Stephanie Linke, June 2025 through October 16, 2025, Laramie County, Wyoming. Most of the cases that appear in the investigative records of any city's law enforcement history involve a moment, a night, a day, an hour that becomes the center of gravity around which an entire investigation is built. But some of the most serious cases in the child welfare files of any jurisdiction are not built around a moment at all. They are built around a pattern, a sustained, deliberate course of conduct that unfolds across weeks and months, hidden from the community, invisible to the systems designed to catch it, endured in silence by a child who has no way out. The case of Stephanie Linke is one of those cases. It unfolded in Cheyenne, Wyoming across the summer and into the fall of 2025, a period of months during which, investigators would allege, a 14-year-old boy lived through something that no child should ever experience, within the walls of a home that was supposed to be the safest place in his world. 14 years old is a particular kind of age. It is the age of developing independence, of high school hallways and weekend plans, and the gradual, imperfect process of becoming a person separate from the family that shaped you. A 14-year-old has opinions, friendships, interests, a developing sense of who they are and who they want to become. They are not an infant entirely dependent on adult care for survival, but they are not yet an adult capable of exercising full self-determination either. They are in between, capable of understanding that something is deeply wrong, but not yet fully equipped to extract themselves from it without help. The 14-year-old boy at the center of this case spent the summer of 2025 not living the way 14-year-olds are supposed to live. According to the charges filed against Stephanie Linke and her partner in Laramie County, he was confined. He was not attending school in the normal way, not moving through the community in the way that young people do, not visible to the teachers and coaches and neighbors and other adults whose presence in a child's life creates the network of awareness that child protective systems depend upon. The alleged abuse that he endured during those months involved something that might, to someone unfamiliar with its physiological effects, sound less immediately alarming than other forms of harm. He was forced to ingest dangerous amounts of water. And while that may not carry the immediate visceral weight of more obviously violent forms of mistreatment, the medical reality of what forced excessive water consumption does to a human body is severe, and in sufficient quantities, life-threatening. The human body maintains a delicate chemical balance, a precise ratio of water to electrolytes, sodium chief among them, that keeps the brain and central nervous system functioning within normal parameters. When that balance is disrupted by the forced ingestion of volumes of liquid that the body cannot safely process, the sodium in the bloodstream is diluted to dangerous levels. The brain responds to this imbalance in ways that range from confusion and disorientation to, in severe cases, seizures. Life-threatening seizures. On October 16, 2025, the 14-year-old boy's body reached its limit. He experienced seizures severe enough to trigger an emergency response, the kind of medical crisis that brings paramedics and law enforcement to a door that had, for months, remained closed to the outside world. When emergency responders arrived, the condition they found the child and began to tell a story. The investigation that followed was the work of Laramie County law enforcement and child welfare professionals piecing together months of documented conduct from physical evidence, medical records, and whatever other documentation the investigation could develop. What that investigation produced was a picture of a sustained, months-long course of alleged abuse, beginning in June of 2025 and continuing until the day the boy's body produced a medical emergency that could no longer be concealed. Stephanie Linke and her partner were charged in Laramie County in connection with this case. The charges reflected the severity and the duration of what the prosecution alleged had been done to this child. Not a single incident of poor parental judgment, but a pattern of conduct extending across 4 months of a 14-year-old's life. What makes cases like this one particularly important to examine in the context of child protection is the mechanism by which they remain hidden for as long as they do. A child who is confined within a household is a child who cannot reach the adults outside that household who might otherwise detect that something is wrong. Mandatory reporter laws, which require teachers, medical professionals, child care providers, and other adults who regularly interact with children to report suspicions of abuse, depend on children being present in the environments where those adults can observe them. A child who stops appearing at school, who withdraws from community activities, who becomes invisible to the network of adults whose presence in their life creates a natural monitoring system. That child is precisely the child most at risk of enduring prolonged harm without detection. The isolation that investigators alleged this 14-year-old experienced was not incidental to the abuse. It was integral to it. Keeping a child away from the people who might ask questions, away from the environments where their absence would be noticed and reported, is itself a form of harm, and it is the mechanism that allows other forms of harm to continue. October 16, 2025, was the day the boy's body delivered the evidence that brought the outside world through the door. The medical emergency he experienced was serious and life-threatening. He survived. That survival, that 14-year-old's body's insistence on continuing to exist despite everything that had been done to it across 4 months of the summer and fall of 2025, is the most important fact in this case. He survived, and the Laramie County legal system was set in motion to ensure that those responsible for what he had endured would face the consequences that the law provides. As of the preparation of this documentary, the legal proceedings against Stephanie Linke and her partner were moving through the Laramie County court system. Both are presumed innocent until and unless a court determines otherwise. The legal process will deliver its verdict in time. But the 14-year-old boy whose summer was stolen, whose months were consumed by what investigators allege was a sustained course of abuse within his own home, is the reason this case exists. His survival, his endurance, his existence as a young person whose safety this community and every community takes seriously as a fundamental obligation. If you are a teacher, a coach, a neighbor, a family friend, or any adult who has regular contact with young people, please pay attention when a child disappears from their normal environments. Prolonged, unexplained absence from school, from activities, from the community life that young people are supposed to inhabit, can be a warning sign that something is deeply wrong behind a door that no one has thought to open. You can report concerns anonymously to the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline at 1-800-422-4453 or to local law enforcement, without providing your name. Your concern does not need to rise to the level of certainty to be worth reporting. It only needs to be real. The Laramie County investigators who responded on October 16, 2025, did their jobs. The 14-year-old at the center of this case survived to see the legal system respond to what had been done to him. That accountability, however the legal proceedings ultimately conclude, is what the community of Cheyenne owed him. Please like this video, drop a comment, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Every share of a story like this one is an act of advocacy for every child whose suffering remains hidden behind a closed door somewhere in our communities. Case 5, Juliette Martinez, November 2025, Laramie County, Wyoming. For months old. Take a moment to hold that in full understanding, not as an abstraction, not as a data point in a case file, but as a reality. A 4-month-old child has been in the world for approximately 120 days. They have spent those days learning to recognize the faces around them, beginning to connect sounds to meanings, discovering the marvel of their own hands, developing the first fragile architecture of trust with the people who hold them and feed them and keep them warm. They are as new to existence as it is possible to be and still be counted as a person in the world. They are also completely, utterly, and without any qualification dependent on every adult around them for every single aspect of their survival. A 4-month-old cannot signal danger, cannot reach for help, cannot make their distress legible to anyone outside the immediate caregiving environment in a way that prompts intervention. They are dependent in the purest and most absolute sense on the care, the restraint, and the protection of the adults who surround them. In November of 2025, in Cheyenne, Wyoming, a 4-month-old boy passed away. He was under the care of his mother, Juliette Martinez, and her boyfriend. The Laramie County investigation that followed the child's passing produced findings that the medical and investigative professionals involved treated with the highest level of seriousness and urgency. The injuries documented were consistent with non-accidental head trauma. This was not, in the assessment of the professionals who examined this child, the result of any accident of ordinary infant care. The harm documented in this 4-month-old boy's body spoke to the deliberate application of force against someone who weighed, at most, a few pounds and possessed no capacity whatsoever to protect himself. Juliette Martinez and her boyfriend were both charged in Laramie County in connection with the child's passing. The charges brought against them reflected the full weight of the prosecution's assessment, first-degree murder charges, and child abuse charges to accompany them. The Laramie County Prosecutorial Office determined that what had happened to this 4-month-old boy warranted the most serious charges available under Wyoming law. The case moved through the Laramie County court system, and by early 2026, plea agreements had been reached by both parties. The details of those plea agreements, the specific charges resolved, the sentences imposed, the formal legal record of what accountability was ultimately delivered, are part of the public court record in Laramie County, Wyoming. The legal process ran its course and arrived at a conclusion. Accountability, in the formal sense that the law provides for, was achieved. But legal accountability does not reach the most important dimension of this case. It does not reach the 4-month-old boy who was the center of this tragedy. It does not speak to who he was becoming, the particular personality emerging from those 120 days of existence, the specific expression on his face when he recognized a familiar voice, the way his hands moved when he was awake and discovering the world. It does not restore any of that, because nothing can. That is the nature of the loss at the center of this case. Non-accidental head trauma in infants is one of the most serious categories of harm that the child welfare and law enforcement communities investigate. It is serious because of the physics of it, the disproportion between the force applied and the extraordinary vulnerability of an infant's developing brain and the structures that surround it. It is serious because of the invisibility of it. An infant who has sustained this type of harm may not show external signs that would immediately alarm a casual observer, making early detection dependent on the observations of medical professionals or caregivers with enough awareness to recognize that something is wrong. It is serious because of the finality of the outcomes it produces, outcomes ranging from permanent developmental harm to the loss of life. The detection of this type of injury and the prosecution of those responsible for it depends on the cooperation of medical professionals, child welfare investigators, and law enforcement working in close coordination. In this case, that coordination produced charges against 2 adults who were in the position of responsibility for a 4-month-old child. The legal system then delivered its resolution through the plea agreement process. For parents and for anyone caring for a very young infant, the sleeplessness, the relentlessness, the weight of the responsibility that comes with caring for a human being this new and this fragile, the moments of overwhelming stress are real. They are acknowledged. They are universal to infant caregiving in a way that no one who has spent a night with a crying baby will dispute. But there is help. There are resources. The National Parent Helpline is available at 1-800-840-8939, a line staffed by people who understand the particular weight of early parenthood and who can provide support, guidance, and connection to additional resources for families who are struggling. Crisis nurseries and respite care programs operate in many communities specifically to provide temporary relief to caregivers who are reaching the end of their endurance. Seeking that help is not a failure. It is the most important thing a caregiver can do for the child in their care when they recognize that they are approaching a limit. The 4-month-old boy at the center of this case deserved every one of those resources to have reached his caregivers before November of 2025. He deserved 120 days of life, followed by many more, by years of the ordinary and extraordinary experiences that make up a human existence. He deserved to be safe in the care of the adults responsible for him. Laramie County delivered the legal accountability that the evidence and the law required. The plea agreements reached in early 2026 ensured that those responsible faced formal consequences. The 4-month-old boy at the center of this case is part of Cheyenne's history, and his story is told here so that his brief, irreplaceable existence is not reduced to a footnote in a legal proceeding, but is remembered as what it was, a life that mattered, taken too soon, mourned by a community that takes its obligation to its youngest members seriously. Please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. These stories are told with care, with accuracy, and with deep respect for every victim at their center. Your support keeps this work going, and it matters more than you know. Case 6, Hannah Wendtland, September 12, 2025, Laramie County, Wyoming. The cases that make the deepest marks on a community's conscience are, almost without exception, the ones involving the most vulnerable victims. The infants, the toddlers, the children who had no power to protect themselves from what was done to them. Those are the cases that produce the most profound grief, the most searching questions about how such things are allowed to happen and what communities can do to prevent them. But a community's obligation to accountability does not begin and end with the cases that produce the most grief. It extends to every situation in which a person's choices place others at risk, in which the decision to act recklessly, or to flee from responsibility, or to prioritize personal escape over the safety of everyone around them, creates the conditions for harm. These cases matter too. They are part of the same story, the story of what a community owes to the principle that choices have consequences and that the law will enforce that principle regardless of the circumstances that surround any particular situation. On September 12, 2025, Hannah Wendtland's choices in Cheyenne, Wyoming created exactly that kind of situation, and the Laramie County legal system was required to respond. The evening of September 12 began with a confrontation at a bar in Cheyenne. The details of that confrontation, its origins, its participants, the specific sequence of events that escalated it from an ordinary dispute to something serious enough to require law enforcement involvement, are part of the investigative record in this case. What is documented is that the altercation was severe enough that police were called and that officers arrived to address a situation that had moved well beyond what the establishment or its patrons could manage. It is at this point that a choice was made. Rather than remaining at the scene, rather than cooperating with the law enforcement officers responding to the altercation, Hannah Wendtland left. She got into a vehicle and she drove away from the scene, fast. What followed was a high-speed pursuit through the streets of Cheyenne. Police vehicles gave chase. The pursuit moved through a city, through intersections, and through stretches of road that on any given evening are populated by drivers, cyclists, pedestrians, and ordinary residents whose only connection to Hannah Wendtland's choices that night was the misfortune of being in the same geographic space at the same moment. None of those people had any warning. None of them had any way to prepare for the risk that was moving toward them at speed. A high-speed pursuit in a populated area is not an abstraction. It is a vehicle moving faster than the environment is designed to accommodate safely, operated by someone whose primary concern is escape rather than the safety of everyone in their path. Every intersection a pursuing vehicle passes through is an intersection where a collision between a fleeing car and a vehicle or pedestrian whose driver or occupant has done nothing wrong could occur, in an instant. The risk created by that flight is real, and it extends to everyone in the vicinity. The pursuit ended. Wendtland was apprehended by Cheyenne law enforcement, and the charges that followed reflected the full scope of what had occurred on the evening of September 12th, both the events at the bar and the decision to flee that had followed them. Felony, aggravated eluding. Hit and run. These are felony-level charges in Wyoming. The legal system's recognition that the conduct involved was not a minor infraction, but a serious endangerment of public safety that required serious accountability. The hit-and-run component of the charges indicated that during the course of the events of that September evening, contact had been made, a collision with another vehicle or with property, and that the response to that contact had been continued flight rather than the legally and morally required act of stopping to address it. The compounding of one poor decision with another, each one extending the reach of the risk being created, is the pattern that the Laramie County legal record in this case documents. The Laramie County court system processed the charges against Hannah Wendtland and delivered the legal accountability that the charges required. The record reflects what occurred on September 12, 2025, and the consequences that followed. This case carries a message that extends beyond the specific events of one September evening. The decisions that people make in moments of heightened emotion, at the end of a night that has gone wrong, in the grip of anger or fear, or the irrational calculus of someone trying to avoid accountability for something they have already done, those decisions reach outward. They affect other people. They create risk for people who have no stake in the original dispute, no knowledge of what is happening, and no ability to protect themselves from a threat they cannot see coming. The roads of Cheyenne belong to everyone who uses them. That shared ownership comes with shared responsibility. When that responsibility is abandoned in favor of flight, the law is designed to respond. And in the case of Hannah Wendtland and the events of September 12, 2025, it did. Please like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Accountability takes many forms, and this channel is committed to documenting all of them, because a community that takes its obligation to safety seriously recognizes that responsibility on every road, in every season, at every hour. Case 7. Hannah Wingert, September 2023, Laramie County, Wyoming. September of 2023 arrived in Cheyenne the way September always does in Wyoming, with the first whisper of the cold that will eventually define the landscape, with the particular quality of light that comes when the summer begins to step back, with the rhythms of a new school year settling into place across the city's neighborhoods and households. For most families in Laramie County, September of 2023 was unremarkable in the way that most months are unremarkable, the texture of ordinary life unfolding in its ordinary way. For a 2-year-old boy in Cheyenne, it was the month that everything changed. The 2-year-old was brought to medical attention in September of 2023 with injuries that immediately raised serious concerns among the physicians who examined him. He had sustained a brain bleed, intracranial injury significant enough to require immediate medical intervention and serious enough to alarm every professional who reviewed his case. Medical staff understood what they were looking at. Child welfare investigators and law enforcement were contacted. The investigation into how a 2-year-old in a Cheyenne home had sustained this level of neurological harm was opened. The boy's mother was Hannah Wingert. She and her boyfriend were both arrested in connection with the injuries the child had sustained. The investigation focused on the circumstances within the household, the timeline of the child's injury, the adults present, the evidence available to investigators working to build a picture of what had happened to this toddler in the days leading up to his medical presentation. A brain bleed in a 2-year-old does not have many innocent explanations. The medical literature is clear on this point. Intracranial injury of the kind that brings a toddler to emergency medical attention is not, in the vast majority of circumstances, the product of ordinary childhood accidents. Falls from normal household heights, tumbles in play, the routine mishaps of toddlerhood do not typically produce the level of neurological harm that investigators and medical professionals were examining in this case. The injuries spoke to force, to something that exceeded the bounds of what any caregiver should ever bring to bear on a 2-year-old. The Laramie County investigative and prosecutorial process moved forward. Hannah Wingert and her boyfriend faced the legal system. And in mid-2024, Approximately a year after the September events that had brought this case to light, Hannah Wingert entered a plea agreement that resolved the charges against her. The plea agreement represented a formal legal resolution, a documented acknowledgement by the legal process that accountability had been established and delivered. The details of that plea agreement, the specific charges resolved, the terms and conditions of the sentencing, are part of the public record in Laramie County and available to anyone who wishes to examine them in full. The legal chapter of this case reached its conclusion through that agreement. But the legal chapter is not the only chapter that matters in a case like this one. The 2-year-old boy at the center of this case was not a case number when investigators first encountered him. He was a child, a small person with the particular personality and presence that every 2-year-old carries, with his own way of moving through the world, his own developing sense of the people and things around him, his own irreplaceable existence. He was 2 years old when his body sustained harm serious enough to require emergency medical care, and he was 2 years old when the adults responsible for that harm were arrested and ultimately held accountable by the Laramie County legal system. He survived. That survival is the most significant fact in this case, more significant than the arrest, more significant than the plea agreement, more significant than any element of the legal proceedings. He survived injuries that, in cases like this one, do not always allow for survival. And whatever the road ahead holds for him, whatever the long-term medical monitoring, the developmental support, the therapeutic intervention that may be required in the aftermath of early childhood neurological injury, that road exists because he survived to walk it. Children who experience significant injury in early childhood often demonstrate a resilience that surprises and humbles the adults around them. The human brain in early development carries a capacity for adaptation and recovery that diminishes with age. That capacity is not a guarantee. The effects of early neurological harm can be lasting and significant, but it is real, and it is one of the reasons that early intervention, thorough medical follow-up, and sustained support for affected children and their families are so critical in the aftermath of cases like this one. The Wyoming child welfare system, the Laramie County legal system, and the medical professionals who treated this child were the network of institutions that responded when his injuries brought him to their attention. That network functioned. Accountability was delivered. The system, on this occasion, worked in the way it is supposed to work. What this case also illustrates, as so many cases involving very young children do, is the importance of adults' self-awareness and support-seeking in caregiving environments. The stress of caring for a toddler, the relentlessness of it, the physical and emotional demands of meeting the needs of a 2-year-old through every hour of every day, is real and it is significant. Adults who are struggling with those demands have options. Parent support groups, crisis lines, respite care, and mental health resources exist precisely because caregiving stress is universal and because the consequences of unaddressed stress in a caregiving environment can be catastrophic for the children involved. If you are a caregiver who is struggling, please reach out. The National Parent Helpline is available at 1-800-840-8939. Your call is confidential. Help is available, and seeking it is the most important thing you can do for the child in your care. Hannah Wingert entered her plea agreement in Laramie County in mid-2024. The legal record is closed. The 2-year-old boy who sustained a brain bleed in September of 2023 is part of Cheyenne's story, and his survival is the fact in this case that the community of Cheyenne holds closest. Please like this video, drop a comment below, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Your support is what makes it possible for stories like this one to reach the people who need to hear them. Thank you for being part of this community. Case 8. Kandace Sitting Eagle, late 2022 through May 2023, Fremont County, Wyoming. There is a particular quality to the discovery of hidden suffering. The moment when investigators or first responders or concerned citizens push open a door or pull back a barrier and find, on the other side, something that should never have been allowed to exist, conditions that human beings should never have been permitted to endure. That moment is one that everyone present carries differently for the rest of their lives. Some carry it as motivation. Some carry it as grief. All carry it as a permanent alteration of their understanding of what is possible behind the walls of an ordinary-looking home. In May of 2023, in the community of Arapahoe, Wyoming, Within the boundaries of the Wind River Indian Reservation in Fremont County, law enforcement made exactly that kind of discovery. And what they found behind the barrier they opened, what the evidence revealed had been happening for months before that door was finally opened, became the basis for a federal prosecution that resulted in a conviction of significant seriousness. A 13-year-old child was found locked in a crawl space. Let that sentence be read without the protective numbness that facts about child welfare cases can sometimes produce in those who follow these stories closely. A 13-year-old child, a young person at the age of high school beginnings, of the particular social and intellectual and emotional development that defines early adolescence, of the stage of life when young people are supposed to be building the skills and the experiences and the relationships that will carry them into adulthood. That child had been locked in a crawl space. The child was malnourished. The condition of their body, the physical evidence of what had been denied to them over an extended period, spoke to a level of deprivation that investigators understood immediately was not a recent development. This had been happening over time. The investigation that followed would establish that the course of conduct stretching back to late 2022, months before the May 2023 discovery, during which this child had been subjected to conditions incompatible with basic human dignity and welfare. Kandace Sitting Eagle was the person responsible for the child's care. She faced federal charges in connection with what investigators documented as a sustained pattern of child abuse, a charge that reflected both the severity of the conditions the child had been forced to endure and the duration across which those conditions had persisted. The jurisdictional dimension of this case is worth noting, because it speaks to the complex legal landscape that governs child welfare on Native American reservations in the United States. When a serious crime occurs within the boundaries of Indian country, federal jurisdiction applies in many circumstances, meaning that the prosecution is handled not by the state of Wyoming, but by federal authorities. The federal prosecution of Kandace Sitting Eagle was the legal system's response to what was found in that crawl space in May of 2023. The prosecution moved forward. The evidence was presented, and Kandace Sitting Eagle was convicted in federal court of child abuse, a conviction that delivered formal legal accountability for a course of conduct that had kept a 13-year-old confined and suffering across months of what should have been an ordinary year of early adolescent life. A crawl space, malnourished, months. The weight of those words deserves to be carried fully. Every day that passed between late 2022 and May of 2023 was a day that this child endured conditions that their body and mind were not equipped to sustain. Every morning that rose and set over Arapahoe, Wyoming during that period was a morning and an evening that this young person spent in circumstances that no investigation, no prosecution, and no conviction can fully address or fully repair. What the system's designed to protect children from exactly this kind of sustained harm, mandatory school attendance requirements, mandatory reporting laws, child welfare check procedures, depend upon is the visibility of children to the communities around them. A child who is concealed is a child who cannot be reached by any of those systems. The discovery in May of 2023 came through some combination of community concern, investigative response, and the opening of a door that had been keeping a 13-year-old invisible to the world outside. The child survived. They were found. They were removed from those conditions and brought into the care of professionals equipped to address what they had endured. The federal conviction of Kandace Sitting Eagle placed the weight of legal accountability on the person the evidence identified as responsible for those conditions. The path of recovery for a young person who has survived months of confinement and deprivation is long and complex. It involves medical care, nutritional restoration, psychological support, and the slow, patient work of rebuilding the sense of safety and trust that sustained mistreatment erodes. It is work that can take years. It is work that the child who was found in that crawl space in May of 2023 deserved from the first moment of their discovery, and which, through the intervention of the federal legal system and the child welfare resources available in Wyoming and on the Wind River Reservation, they were positioned to receive. For communities within Indian Country, the Indian Country Child Abuse Hotline is available at 1-800-786-4407. Child welfare resources specific to Native American families and communities are available through the National Indian Child Welfare Association. No child, in any community, in any jurisdiction, should be allowed to endure what this 13-year-old endured. And the reporting of concerns to the appropriate authorities is the act that transforms a situation of hidden suffering into one where intervention becomes possible. Federal accountability was delivered in this case. The door that had hidden a child's suffering was opened by investigators who did their jobs thoroughly and with the seriousness that the situation demanded. That is what the system is supposed to do. In May of 2023, in Fremont County, Wyoming, it did. Please like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. The children in these stories deserved advocates when they needed them most. By watching, by sharing, and by staying informed, you become part of the community of awareness that makes advocacy possible. Thank you. Case 9, Carolyn Aune, March 11, 2021, Park County, Wyoming. The law speaks in many registers. It speaks loudly and clearly in the language of prohibition. Do not do this. Do not cause this harm. Do not take this action that damages another person. That is the register most people are most familiar with, the one that governs the active conduct the law is most commonly invoked to address. But the law also speaks in another register, one that is less frequently discussed and perhaps less intuitively understood by those who have not encountered it directly, the register of obligation. The register that says not merely that you must not cause harm, but that in certain relationships and certain circumstances, you are required to act, required to intervene, required to seek help, required to do the thing that the situation demands, because the law recognizes that failing to do it, choosing passivity when action is required, can be as consequential as any active harmful choice. This is the doctrine of the duty to protect, and it is the legal framework at the center of the case of Carolyn Aune, which arose from events in Cody, Wyoming, in Park County, on March 11, 2021. Carolyn Aune was in a relationship with a man whose 2-year-old daughter was part of their shared household. A 2-year-old girl, a toddler still in the earliest stages of developing her independence, still entirely dependent on the adults around her for safety and care, still at the age where the world is experienced largely through the filter of the people who hold her and feed her and keep her out of harm's way. On March 11, 2021, that 2-year-old girl was in a state that required emergency medical attention. The severity of her condition, the nature of the injuries that investigators and medical professionals would document in this case, was evident. It was the kind of condition that any adult observing it would immediately understand required urgent intervention. A child in serious medical distress. A child whose body was telling anyone who looked at it that something had gone terribly wrong, and that time was critical. Carolyn Aune did not call for help. She did not seek emergency medical care for the child. She did not make the phone call that, in a situation of this severity, was not merely the morally correct choice but the legally required one. The duty to protect that the law places on adult caregivers in a household, the affirmative obligation to take action when a child in your care is in danger, was not discharged on March 11, 2021. The 2-year-old girl did not survive. The injuries she had sustained, left unaddressed, without the medical intervention that remained possible in the hours when help could still have made a difference, took her life. The investigation that followed her passing examined 2 distinct questions. The first question, as always in cases involving the serious harm of a child, was the question of how the injuries had occurred and who bore responsibility for them. The second question, the question that ultimately became the legal basis of the case against Carolyn Aune, was the question of what happened after those injuries occurred. What did the adults in that household do, and what did they fail to do, in the hours when this child's life was still in the balance? Carolyn Aune was charged in Park County with first-degree felony murder. The charge was grounded in the legal principle that her failure to seek medical care for this 2-year-old child, her failure to fulfill the duty to protect that her role in the household created, had directly contributed to the child's death. Under Wyoming law, this is not a lesser category of culpability. First-degree felony murder is among the most serious charges the Wyoming Criminal Code contains, and it carries the weight of the law's most significant accountability mechanisms. The Park County legal process moved forward. The evidence was presented. The jury deliberated. And Carolyn Aune was convicted. The verdict of first-degree felony murder was the Park County court system's formal statement, on behalf of the community, that the failure to protect a child in serious medical danger, when that failure costs the child their life, is a crime of the highest seriousness. The sentencing that followed the conviction reflects the gravity of that legal determination. The specifics of the sentence imposed are part of the public record in Park County, Wyoming, and they speak to the judiciary's understanding of the weight of the conduct at issue. The 2-year-old girl who passed away on March 11, 2021, in Cody, Wyoming, was 2 years old. She was a toddler. She had been in this world long enough to know the faces around her, long enough to have developed the particular personality that toddlers carry, long enough to have become someone specific and irreplaceable. She was not old enough to seek help for herself. She was not old enough to understand her situation well enough to find a way out of it. She was dependent, in the way that 2-year-olds are dependent, on the adults in her orbit to recognize what she needed and to provide it. On March 11, 2021, the adult who bore the legal duty to provide it did not. Park County delivered a verdict that said this clearly and formally. The conviction of Carolyn Aune for first-degree felony murder established in the legal record of Wyoming that the duty to protect a child is not a suggestion. It is not a moral preference that adults in caregiving roles are free to set aside when exercising it feels inconvenient or complicated or frightening. It is a legal obligation, and its breach, when that breach costs a child their life, is accounted for by the law. For anyone who finds themselves in a situation of uncertainty about whether a child needs medical attention, whether the situation is serious enough to warrant a call for help, the answer is always to call. Emergency medical dispatchers, pediatric nursing lines, and local medical facilities are all available around the clock. The cost of being wrong in the direction of caution is a hospital visit. The cost of being wrong in the direction of inaction, as the events of March 11, 2021 demonstrated, can be a child's life. Please like this video, leave a comment below, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. The duty to protect the children around us belongs to every adult in every community. This case is a reminder of what is at stake when that duty is not honored. Thank you for watching. Case 10, Cheri Lynn Marler, November 25, 2022, Lincoln County, Wyoming. Every case in this documentary carries its own weight. Every name, every date, every set of facts drawn from the court records of Wyoming's counties represents a specific human life, a specific child, in a specific household, on a specific day, and the legal process that followed when investigators determined that what had happened to that child required accountability. These are not interchangeable stories. They are individual. The final case in this documentary is one that carries a particular weight of its own, not merely because of the severity of what occurred, but because of the day on which it occurred, and because of the age of the child at the center of it, and because of the way the legal proceedings that followed unfolded in Lincoln County, Wyoming over the months and years that came after November of 2022. On November 25, 2022, Thanksgiving Day, a 5-year-old girl in the care of Cheri Lynn Marler suffered injuries in the community of Kemmerer, Wyoming that would end her life. Thanksgiving. A day built around the idea of gathering, around the warmth of family and shared spaces, around the particular magic that holidays hold for young children who experience them as events of heightened wonder and special permission and the presence of people they love. A 5-year-old on Thanksgiving is a child in one of the most joyful developmental phases of early childhood, old enough to anticipate the holiday, old enough to participate in it with genuine delight, old enough to carry the memory of it forward into the years to come. For the 5-year-old in Cheri Lynn Marler's care, November 25, 2022 held none of that. Investigators and medical professionals who examined this child documented injuries that were fatal. The child did not survive. And the question at the center of the Lincoln County investigation and prosecution that followed was the question that sits at the heart of every case involving a child's sudden and unexplained passing in a household. What had caused these injuries, and was the explanation offered by the person responsible for the child's care consistent with the evidence? Cheri Lynn Marler's explanation was that the child had been injured in a fall. A fall, the kind of accident that occurs in households with young children, the kind of terrible coincidence that anyone who has raised a child understands as a theoretical possibility, however rare and however devastating. The defense presented this position throughout the legal proceedings and argued that the evidence before the court was consistent with an accidental cause. The Lincoln County jury examined that argument carefully. They heard the medical testimony, the forensic and clinical documentation of the nature, location, and severity of the injuries sustained by the 5-year-old girl. They heard the prosecution's witnesses, who testified to their professional conclusions about what the evidence showed and what it did not show. They heard the defense's challenge to those conclusions and the alternative explanation that was offered for how a 5-year-old could have sustained those injuries accidentally on Thanksgiving Day. And they rejected the defense's position unanimously. After deliberation, after the careful application of the legal standard, proof beyond a reasonable doubt, that Wyoming law requires before a jury can return a guilty verdict, Cheri Lynn Marler was found guilty of first-degree murder. First-degree murder, the most serious finding that a criminal jury can deliver under Wyoming law. The verdict of the Lincoln County jury was a formal legal determination, reached by 12 people who heard all of the evidence and applied the law as it was given to them, that the 5-year-old girl in Cheri Lynn Marler's care on Thanksgiving Day of 2022 had not lost her life in a fall. She had suffered fatal harm that the jury determined, beyond a reasonable doubt, was deliberately inflicted. The sentencing that followed the conviction reflects the gravity of a first-degree murder verdict. The specifics are part of the public record in Lincoln County, Wyoming. The legal chapter of this case reached its conclusion through that verdict and that sentencing, and the Lincoln County court system delivered the accountability that the evidence required. But legal conclusions, however significant, are the architecture of accountability, not the substance of the story. The substance of this story is a 5-year-old girl on Thanksgiving Day. It is her age and her specific presence in the world at the age of 5, which is an age of personality and of preferences and of relationships and of the particular certainty that children this age carry about what they like and what they do not like and who they love and what they want to be when they grow up. It is the day on which her life ended, a day that the culture of this country fills with warmth and family and the celebration of what we are grateful for. She deserved to grow up. She deserved to carry the memory of Thanksgiving days forward into an adult life, to eventually celebrate the holiday as a grown person with her own preferences and relationships and things to be grateful for. She deserved all of the ordinary and extraordinary things that a human life can contain. The Lincoln County jury said, formally and finally, that what had been done to her on November 25, 2022, was wrong. That someone would be held responsible. That the law's most serious accountability mechanism would be brought to bear on the person the evidence identified as responsible for her death. That verdict is not justice in the fullest sense, because justice, in the fullest sense, would have kept her alive. But it is the law's best effort to honor the weight of what was lost. And it is the community of Lincoln County, Wyoming's formal statement that a 5-year-old girl's life mattered and that the person responsible for ending it would not escape accountability. Kemmerer, Wyoming, a small community in the southwestern corner of the state, far from Cheyenne's familiar skyline, removed from the urban rhythms that define the experiences documented elsewhere in this film, carried this case forward through its legal system with the same seriousness and the same commitment to accountability that every corner of Wyoming owes to its children. The Lincoln County Court did its job. The jury deliberated with care. The verdict reflects the weight of the evidence and the weight of the loss at the center of this case. For every caregiver who watched this documentary and who recognizes, in the stories told here, the importance of the choices made in every household where a child is present, please remember that help is available when the weight of responsibility becomes difficult to carry alone. The National Parent Helpline at 1-800-840-8939 is available to any parent or caregiver who is struggling. The Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline at 1-800-422-4453 is available for anyone with concerns about a child in their community. These resources exist because communities that take children seriously invest in the prevention of tragedy, not only in the accountability that follows it. The 5-year-old girl at the center of this case is part of Wyoming's history. She is part of the story this documentary tells about what communities owe to their children and about the legal systems they build to deliver accountability when that obligation is violated. Her name, her age, the day on which her life ended, and the verdict that the Lincoln County jury returned on her behalf. All of it belongs to the record. All of it is told here so that she is remembered as a child who deserved better, and so that every person who watches this documentary carries that memory forward. If this documentary informed you, moved you, or renewed your commitment to the protection of children in your community, please like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Sharing this content extends the reach of these stories to audiences who need to hear them. Every subscriber, every share, every comment is a contribution to the community of awareness that makes this work meaningful. These are Wyoming's cases. 10 names. 10 children whose stories demanded to be told. 10 moments in which the legal systems of this state's counties were called upon to respond to the harm of those who could not protect themselves, and 10 records of what that response produced. The Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline, 1-800-422-4453. Available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. Call or text 988. The National Parent Helpline, 1-800-840-8939. Wyoming's Safe Haven. Any hospital, fire station, or law enforcement agency will accept a newborn anonymously and without prosecution. Thank you for watching Cold Case Hour. We will continue telling these stories with accuracy, with dignity, and with the unwavering commitment that the victims at their center deserve. Stay informed, stay aware, and look out for the children in your community. Every single one of them.